Welcome back to our studies in public law. This is in fact our final lesson on the grounds for judicial review. We've done 12 in total, and we're going to talk about this idea of legitimate expectations, which is just a little final point to wrap up the rest of this topic. Now, fundamentally, we're gonna explore this last topic here on legitimate expectations, and then we're going to move away from judicial review to looking at police powers. And then we will finish off with some members-only content looking at public order and terrorism legislation and right to assembly and all these different kinds of things. So, this lesson, we're going to look at the concept of legitimate expectations. We shall explore the language of legitimate expectations, where it was first introduced into the law, and some of the implications of it therein. Fundamentally, when we think about legitimate expectations, we have to first ask the question, what are legitimate expectations, and how does this apply to the grounds for judicial review? Well, a legitimate expectation is simply something that is said to be lesser than a right, not quite as strong as a right, but still protected under the ordinary rules of natural justice. So, think of legitimate expectations firstly as a subset of the basic principles of natural justice, for a start. So we're still talking about procedural impropriety, we're still talking about that as a ground for judicial review, we're still talking about natural justice being legitimized under that particular basis, but we're thinking about the idea of legitimate expectations here. The term was first coined by Lord Denning in the case of Schmidt versus the Home Office from 1969. Specifically in this case, we have a group of students who are residing in the United Kingdom, and they are residing at the Hubbard College of Scientology. So, for those of you who don't know what Scientology is, there's a South Park episode that seems to summarize Scientology actually quite accurately. And fundamentally, the Home Secretary wanted to have their stay extension rejected. So they were residing in the United Kingdom. They had their stay extension that essentially they wanted to have an extension of their stay in the United Kingdom, and the Home Secretary wanted to have that get that rejected and then get them deported essentially. They applied for judicial review on the grounds that what this rejection did was represent a violation of the basic principle of natural justice, namely the basic principle that every single person has a right to be given a fair hearing, and so they ought to have a fair hearing before they have their stay extension rejected. The Court of Appeal rejected this claim. They rejected this judicial review argument, arguing that the applicants did not have a right to stay, nor did they have a legitimate expectation that this stay would be extended. So, like we said, remember, not exactly a right, but a legitimate expectation. Read that using the sort of ordinary meaning of the words and the language that you would come across when you are just reading ordinary English. They said, quote, "If the foreign alien's permit is revoked before the time limit expires, he ought, I think, to be given an opportunity of making representations, for he would have a legitimate expectation of being allowed to stay for a permitted time." So fundamentally, there was not a legitimate expectation that they would have their stay extended. And so we can then go from this to another case, the case here of Pamponet versus the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, and we can see how the application of this principle extends. This case was a case involving the Privy Council, of course. We're talking about the part of the Commonwealth, Trinidad and Tobago. And it was made clear by the Privy Council in this case that a legitimate expectation must be based on a promise, representation, or an undertaking. So the previous case that we just looked at coins the term legitimate expectation, and we see this as something that is not quite a right, but maybe something a little bit lesser than a right. But it doesn't give us much about what actually is a legitimate expectation, where a legitimate expectation should be based, how it should be formulated, and what foundations can we really understand to be the basis for legitimate expectation. This case gives us a little bit more clarity in relation to this. It's based on a promise, representation, or an undertaking. In addition, there must be a certain amount of clarity it must be unambiguous, and it must be devoid of relevant qualification. These are really where we see the existence of legitimate expectations. The case itself concerned an association of taxi operators who all had their own taxi stands. They were given the opportunity to move their taxi stands into a transit centre, which was operated by a separate company. This was operated by their competitor. The point here, essentially, was that they were supposed to have the ability to own and manage their own stands, but would be doing so under the ownership of this company, sort of under the umbrella of this larger company. However, what then happened was the company then introduced a fee of $1 for each exit journey, which then, of course, would cost the taxi operators every time they left this taxi area, this separate transit center. They applied for judicial review on the grounds that they had legitimate expectation that they could manage their property without a fee. So notice here, this isn't a right. They don't have a right to manage the property without a fee. They had a legitimate expectation. It was expected on the basis of the agreement that was made and on the basis of the nature of the agreement that was eventually formulated that there wouldn't be a fee in the operation of their business. Then subsequently a fee then gets introduced, which is then of course in contrary to this legitimate expectation. It was held by the Privy Council that this was indeed a legitimate expectation and that this was indeed enforceable. And so they did have a good claim in judicial review. In terms of representations, it was held that it must be clear, unambiguous, and devoid of qualifications, as we noted, and that it must be based in either a promise, representation, or an undertaking. So if they were clearly promised that they would be able to operate their taxi journey, their taxi business without a fee inside this transit center, then you have a clear, unambiguous promise which is devoid of relevant qualifications. This then basically forms the basis for the existence of a legitimate expectation. Finally, then, let's look at this case here, a very recent case from 2019. This is an application of judicial review from Northern Ireland, and it was a case which involved the murder of a man by Northern Ireland, by loyalist terrorists. I'm not going to get into the back and forths of the various different contexts in which terrorism and radicalism and political radicalism took place in Northern Ireland. Go and read the Troubles if you want to have a better understanding of the history. But fundamentally, we have a loyalist terrorist in Northern Ireland that had murdered an individual. The widow of the man argued that she, in fact, had a legitimate expectation to a public inquiry into the death of her husband. The reason for this was relating to a report which was done by a judge, which indicated that the loyalists may have been in collusion with various different security services, of course, which worked for the British government. So there was this potential conspiracy, if you will, of the British government having something to do with or having some sort of collusion with, by extension of their security services, this loyalist terrorist group, which then went on to murder this woman's husband. She thought, I have a legitimate expectation to a public inquiry, given the fact that there was some shady things going on, potentially shady things going on, between these loyalists and the security services working for the British government. It was held that even though it was sufficiently clear and unambiguous, it was considered that there was an overriding interest on the part of the government which could serve to frustrate the legitimate expectation. This is quite interesting, because essentially what the Supreme Court does is hold that there is a sufficient clarity, it is sufficiently unambiguous, and so that upon an ordinary reading, you would be inclined to conclude that there was a legitimate expectation. But they said that there was still, however, an overriding interest. This was an overriding interest on the part of the British government. They held that, quote, where political issues overtake a promise or undertaking given by government, and where contemporary considerations impel a different course, provided a bona fide decision is taken on genuine policy grounds not to adhere to the original undertaking, it will be difficult for a person who holds a legitimate expectation to enforce compliance with it. So this is essentially a case which caveats the existence of legitimate expectations. Not only do you have to prove the existence of a legitimate expectation first in order to try and get a successful judicial review claim, but you also, secondly, have to have a legitimate expectation which cannot be overridden by political issues and by genuine bona fide decisions that are taken on policy grounds which would not adhere to original undertakings. At which point the courts would often sympathize and often side more with the government than with you, essentially. Saying here, quote, "It will be difficult for a person who holds a legitimate expectation to enforce compliance with it."